All right, Doomberg, hello. It's a bit weird. I'm talking to a green chicken, but hello.
You get used to it. Good afternoon, Peter. Hi, Danny. Great to be here.
Well, listen, it's great to have you on the show. You've become one of the most requested people to come on What Bitcoin Did. I must get an email, I don't know, every week, 2 weeks, for somebody saying, "Can you get Doomberg on? Can you get Doomberg on?" And I've been following and listening, reading your emails, and so it's great to get you on. Appreciate you giving up some time. Most people are on holiday at the moment, so I appreciate that.
Well, we like to say when you're doing the work of your life, it doesn't feel like work, and so you don't really need a holiday when you get to play for a living. And we have actually a pretty substantial following amongst Bitcoin fans, which is surprising since we at least initially started writing critically about more broadly the crypto space, of course. But they're some of our best fans, and it's great to be on, and really great that you accommodated us as well on the technology side.
Yeah, we like to do interviews in person, but sometimes it costs us because there's people you can't get to, or some people want to remain anonymous. So we're going to try and keep most in person. But look, if we have to do remote ones, we'll do them. If the content's good enough or the person's good enough, we want to do it. And yeah, I mean, look, I've seen you guys come up. I've seen the Doomberg team create a bit of a splash over this, especially this last year. And I think it's a lot to do with the energy markets, because energy's become this hot topic. Not just for us as Bitcoiners. I mean, we consider it as Bitcoiners because we get criticized a lot for it, but also just personally. I mean, I'm in the UK at the moment, and we do have an energy crisis. We do have people unable to, they can't afford to heat their homes. And I think it's just become this kind of real hot topic that people want to know a lot more about. I've read some of your articles on it, and we really want to dig into that with you today. But it would be good, just for those who don't know, please explain what the Doomberg project is, the background, and I know you can't tell us who's behind it, but what is the mission here?
Sure. Yeah, so Doomberg is the work of my life, and it's we run a substack. We publish 6 to 8 articles a month, as you alluded to. We come from the energy commodity space, so our background is I'm a PhD scientist, and I spent a couple of decades in the commodity sector in various roles, a lot of technology development roles in the renewable energy space in particular, and so we know that space pretty well. We were a small consulting firm for several years, and then we got hit by COVID, like everybody else. Got hit pretty hard, actually, and decided to reinvent ourselves and opened up a line of consulting where we helped content creators who sold into Wall Street run their businesses better, and that was great. And then one of our largest clients encouraged us to start our own because we always joked with this person that they wouldn't listen to all of our advice, and he said, "Well, if you do your own, you'll have nobody to blame but yourself if it doesn't succeed." And so we did. We launched Doomberg in May of 2021, and it's been a fascinating ride. A year later, we went to a paid newsletter. We've had a lot of success. We've been able to put our old business basically on runoff, and now we essentially just do Doomberg for a living. And at last I checked, we were number one in the world on the finance category, which is a great category to be involved with. And so, yeah, it's really been an amazing thrill. It's been an amazing ride. It's succeeded beyond all our wildest imagination. So here we are, talking to you.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we'll get you a few more subscribers, people listening to this show. But yeah, this year is for us, the energy has just become this whole hot topic for Bitcoiners. And as I said, wider communities as well, especially in the UK. And you sign off for your emails like energy is life. How do you kind of explain what's happened in 2022? What is your kind of overall kind of feelings about what's happened in 22?
Yeah, so what happened in 2022 actually began in 2021, really, but a crisis in Europe, which is where you are. And by the way, we're publishing a piece on this tomorrow called The Whims of Gaia. Basically, an energy crisis in Europe spread to the rest of the world, and the crisis derives from several factors, one of which is sort of a deep opposition to fossil fuels and, most importantly, nuclear power, a total reliance on intermittent renewable energy. And then obviously, the war in Ukraine added fuel to the fire, pardon the metaphor. But things got much worse after the tanks rolled over the line in Ukraine. And Europe basically was forced to pay whatever the market clearing price was for every BTU of energy it could get, regardless of its carbon footprint or its cost. And they did. And then thus far this winter, luckily, Mother Nature has done some favors for Europe, and the worst of the crisis and some of the worst case scenario risks seem to have been taken off the table, which is something we cheer wholeheartedly. But essentially, The world found out in 2022 that during times of energy abundance, it's easy to take for granted just how important energy is to the operation of our society. And during times of energy scarcity, like we had in the middle of 2022, things can go a little haywire, and they did. And we saw prices that were unthinkable. We hope that the weather continues, but Europe's got to turn around and do it all over again for next winter, this time without the benefit of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So, and things went global pretty quickly. So, Europe incrementally bidding for every cargo of LNG caused global prices in the rest of the world to rise, and coal being more expensive than oil for a good period of time this year is a remarkable thing. So really, everything just sort of went haywire, and it just proves just how important energy is. Like the old saying goes, you really miss the electricity when it goes off.
Yeah. So I kind of want to understand a little bit more about how we got here, especially in Europe. My personal kind of experience of understanding energy, and specifically with regards to climate change, I was definitely somebody when I was, maybe even 5 years ago, maybe even less, was somebody highly concerned about global warming and highly concerned with the use of fossil fuels. And I've kind of gone on a journey where I spent a bit of time listening to and reading a lot of the work of Alex Epstein, who I don't agree with entirely, but he did also make me kind of reconsider a lot of the roles of different kind of forms of energy. And so I've been trying to go down this rabbit hole, trying to understand what should the energy mix be? Are renewables good for society? So I kind of want to dig into a few bits of this with you, but is there a kind of, have you come to a point where you have like a perfect energy mix? What do you think the energy mix should be?
Yeah, so our view is that there is no path to decarbonization that does not involve nuclear power, nuclear energy at the heart of it. There are paths to radically reduce our energy consumption, which involve mass starvation and death and suffering, but we take a view that that's an unacceptable option. And we also read Alex's work, and I was fortunate enough to be a guest on his podcast. And he's a brilliant guy. He makes a very powerful argument, and he is certainly an extremely effective debater on the topic, and comes prepared, as you probably experienced. But in our view, nuclear power at the heart of it. There's always going to be a need for fossil fuels, especially in certain applications where electricity and batteries won't work. Imagine diesel trucks in mines and so on. We laid out a policy that has nuclear power at the heart of it. And if we are going to do solar, then we should redomesticate that supply chain instead of having China control over 98% of some of the key manufacturing choke points. And then there is a place for fossil fuels and natural gas. We think natural gas should replace coal, especially in home heating. There's still parts of Europe, Poland in particular, where literally heating your homes with coal is common. But the path has to go through nuclear, and that's the thing that is most puzzling about the climate change movement, as they have rebranded themselves, is their deep opposition to what is the obvious solution. A freshly built nuclear power plant today comes with essentially no risk, could last a century, produces carbon-free electricity effectively indefinitely, is technology we completely understand, and the energy payback period itself is less than 6 weeks. So the total amount of energy that goes into constructing a nuclear power plant gets paid back in 6 weeks, whereas with solar, you're looking as a period measured in years. And so, there will come a time where we land on the sane answer, only after we've tried all the stupid ones. But the proactive shutdown of much of Europe's nuclear fleet, especially in Belgium and Germany, is a scandal of epic proportions. And the genesis of that movement needs to be investigated, because I think if you do, you'll find significant foreign interference with that particular domestic policy.
Okay, you're alluding to something there. Is there anything more you can say on that?
Oh, I think there's a lot of evidence that Russia is behind much of the German opposition to nuclear energy. And, the former, his name escapes me, but the former chancellor of Germany sits on the board of, Gazprom. It's just unquestionable that prior to the Ukraine invasion, the biggest beneficiary of European fallacies on nuclear energy was Russia. In fact, as we've learned, the entire German manufacturing sector became addicted to cheap Russian natural gas. And the struggles they're going to have in the years ahead can be tied directly to the fateful decision to roll the dice and join with Russia for something as critically important as their fundamental energy needs. And so now what we see is a return to coal. You know, if you look at the carbon footprint of the German electricity grid, it's often above 500 grams of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour of electricity, whatever the metrics are, bested only by Poland. Whereas Norway is, and France, which has a large nuclear fleet, which thankfully is now being run a little bit better than it had been, much, much greener. And so the solution exists. If you take Ontario, it has basically a carbon-free grid. It's supplied by nuclear power and hydro electricity, very, very, very little natural gas, and no coal. It can be done. Last I checked, Ontario was a civilized society, and the streets were clean, and you could walk around and enjoy nature. This is all really just a farce. Proactively shutting down nuclear power plants, as I said at the beginning of this answer, is a scandal. And I think when this is done, and it will be done, this, like all crises, will pass. A real hard look at how we got here, I think, is in order.
Where were the main objections for nuclear coming from? Was it like a propaganda message that managed to filter through all of Europe?
Yeah, especially in Germany. And then with the Fukushima accident, that's when the opponents of nuclear power really pushed hard. It's a fascinating thing. Like even the Californians, the most liberal part of the U.S. recognized that shutting down Diablo Canyon was maybe a mistake in the middle of rolling blackouts as it is. Diablo Canyon produces 10% of California's electricity and 20% of its baseload power. And yet they were thinking about closing it down. And this is how deep the propaganda against it has gone. We wrote a piece tackling this fallacy that nuclear waste is some dramatic, generational condemnation of a environmental calamity. It's all made up. I mean, literally, you cannot find a single death associated with a nuclear waste. And yet people die all the time drilling for oil and gas. And most of the solar in the world comes from slave labor in China. These are all trade-offs. There are no answers. There are only trade-offs. And when you measure all of the trade-offs, nuclear power is so fundamentally better that it's a joke. Now, a lot of this, too, can be ascribed to what is known as sort of the Malthusian origins of the modern environmental movement, where literally there's a strong streak of anti-human sort of population bomb fears where they would like less people on the planet, to which we say, you first. I guess, sure, why don't you lead by example on that one? And surprisingly few of them do. But yeah, so if you go back and look in the 50s and 60s, the main fear of environmentalists was the propagation of nuclear power precisely because it delivered plentiful bounties of energy to what they would consider the unwashed masses. And they worried that these unwashed masses, armed with bountiful energy, would soak up all the other resources of the world and leave less for them. And so this is true. This is at the heart of the environmental movement still. We argue because their policies today are indistinguishable from the policies that flowed from the Malthusian origins of those radical movements. And they have been extraordinarily effective in managing the propaganda, much to the shame of the nuclear power industry. They've just been lapped by far more effective attorneys and PR firms and passionate guests on television. And thank God we have the Alex Epsteins of the world to finally begin to make the counterpoint that society needs to hear.
Specifically with Fukushima, that was kind of like a unique scenario with where it was positioned, right? Its location near the ocean. Wasn't that like something that people were critical of?
Sure. I mean, in hindsight, yeah, you're probably not the best place in the world to build a nuclear power plant, but at the same time, the world still spins. I mean, I've been to Japan since then. It's again, we dropped, how many bombs did we drop in World War II in Europe? We literally dropped 2 nuclear bombs in Japan. The dangers of nuclear power, especially freshly built ones, where you can take things like that into account, have been so widely overblown that it's borderline criminal.
Interesting. So with regards to nuclear, if that is to be centered to this, what's the kind of timescale on this? Because we hear, we've had various people on the show to talk about nuclear, and they always talk about, well, to have a new nuclear plant could be 10 to 25 years. I've heard those kind of broad range of dates, but is that all just regulation which is slowing things down?
Of course, yes. Look, we wrote a piece about how crisis can speed things up. In the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about how Germany has made this floating natural gas LNG import facility in a year when it would typically take 5. The same environmentalists who sue to slow every new project down as much as possible, who stack regulatory agencies with their allies, who advocate for laws be passed that totally restrict the ability to get anything done in a sensible fashion, turn around and say, oh, it's too expensive and takes too long. Like, that's a choice. We did the Manhattan Project in 3 years. Like, Germany has proven, it's the exception that proves the rule. The fact that they were able to build this LNG import facility on a moment's notice, that tells you that this is basically a choice.
Right. Okay. So realistically, how long would a nuclear plant take? Because what I'm trying to imagine is, like, specifically with regards to the UK, I think we've commissioned a new nuclear plant to be built. But realistically, if the government wanted to push this forward, is this something that could take 3 years?
Sure. Here's the proof. Go to China.
Yeah.
They have 50 reactors under construction and another 100 in design. And I can assure you it's not going to take them 10 years to build these reactors. Now, maybe we want to have slightly better standards and a little bit more regulatory oversight. We're all for an appropriate amount of oversight. But there's anybody who's arguing that it's too expensive or takes too long is probably part of the reason why it's too expensive and takes too long. So there needs to be a regulatory shift. There needs to be an embracement, a get-it-done mentality, a crisis mentality, because we're in one. And so, we wrote about this. I think it was a piece called Molecular Delusions, where basically because of the crisis, they could just turn around and build this thing in less than a year. And so if the UK truly had to, it wouldn't take 10 years to build a nuclear reactor. You could buy basically pre-designed reactors today.
So can you talk to me a little bit about what's been happening in France then with regards to their nuclear reactors? Because as I understand it, they actually have quite a lot compared to the rest of Europe. I think when we looked down what was it, like 50, 52 or something? But at the same time, I heard like something like half of them weren't currently operational. What's happened in France? Yeah,
so France is an example of mismanaging an asset, as opposed to, it's more a condemnation of the management of that asset, the maintenance of it, and upkeep of it, versus the underlying technology itself. Although it is being used, their mismanagement of their nuclear fleet is being used to hammer nuclear power advocates. And so, let no crisis go to waste, I suppose, if you're a propagandist. But yeah, at its peak, I believe France got something like 80% of its electricity from nuclear power. The capacity, the measurement of how effective a power plant is something called its capacity factor, which is basically the percent of time it's operating at its full capacity. And in the U.S. and in Germany, easy to achieve 90+% capacity factors, whereas France this year at the lowest was somewhere in the high 50s. But they're climbing back now, and not a moment too soon, because Europe needs every electron it could get its hands on. Coming into winter here. But yeah, so France is an example both of how you can design an entire grid around nuclear power, and they have done so for decades. They have amongst the lowest carbon footprints in the EU, I believe second only to Norway, which gets almost all of its electricity from hydro. But at the same time, it's also an example of how you have to invest to maintain, no matter what, power, no matter where you get your power from. Like, windmills need to be serviced and solar panels need to be cleaned. And nuclear power plants need to be upkept. And if you Google around, you'll see that there's actually a bit of a scandal there as well. And so we shall see. But the good news is that the nuclear reactors are coming back to closer to the capacity factors that they've been designed to operate at.
Is this why I've seen some people talk about, like, energy, this energy crisis was probably going to last till about 2026. Is this people kind of counting that it might be like 3-4 years to fix this kind of nuclear problem?
I think actually that
I maybe read that on yours.
Yeah, the timeline is driven by the speed with which worldwide natural gas markets harmonize, which is driven by the speed with which LNG export facilities can be built and the speed with which LNG import facilities and the associated pipelines can be built, which is why we mentioned this German miracle, this engineering miracle in Germany that they were able to build one so quickly. If you look at the announced projects and the speed of construction, I should maybe explain why natural gas is so critical, because natural gas is a gas and it's very hard to ship around the world. And in order to ship it, you have to chill it to incredibly low temperatures and then put it on these highly specialized LNG cargo boats. And to chill it at the export facility is an entirely different process than to regasify it at the import facility, which is why you need both. And so we saw at the height of the energy crisis, natural gas in Europe actually touched $100 per million BTU while it was trading for $3 per million BTU in Canada. And the exact same molecules were selling for a factor of 30 difference in price. Well, that's because Canada has an abundance. Europe had a chronic shortage, and the price elasticity of demand for these things is pretty steep. And so the timeline of particularly when the LNG import facilities are fully constructed in Europe, that's when the crisis will abate. I think they have one more hard winter to go. But countries like the US, Qatar, and Australia are building out, especially Qatar and the US, are building out massive amounts of LNG export facilities and the pipelines to connect the fields to these exports. And then Europe has to build out the ability to receive this natural gas. But there's still a big decision ahead for Germany. They have 3 nuclear reactors that they've extended through till April. If they choose to shut those down, well, first of all, it's crazy, but it also means it'll be all that much tougher to get through next winter. If Germany did not have the 3 reactors online right now that it did, I could assure you that December would have been a far tougher experience than thankfully it has been. And so their decision to keep it open was a wise one.
Is there any indication of what they're going to do with this, though?
I can't imagine that they would be silly enough to shut it down. That would shock me. I mean, at some point, if they did, you'd almost have to throw your hands in the air and say, well, you deserve what's coming. We have a lot of subscribers in Germany. I've visited Germany dozens of times. I have a lot of warm feelings for the country. I don't want them to go through a crisis. But at some point, if you just stab yourself in the eye with a pen enough times, you can't complain about being blind. And so we shall see.
I just want to go back to, you mentioned earlier, you said that the payback period for a nuclear plant is six weeks, which kind of blew my mind. Is there kind of like a rough math on that you can explain?
Sure. Yeah, the energy payback period, not the financial payback period. Basically, to make a nuclear power plant requires a fixed amount of cement and piping and various controls. But the uranium fuel is so energy dense and produces so much electricity for basically free thereafter. That the amount of energy and by the way, because nuclear reactors run 24/7 at 90% capacity factor, essentially, it takes almost no time at all for these things to pay back their energy. When you compare the energy intensity of solar, we wrote a whole piece on this because, of course, that is a very political number, but we wrote a piece in November called Solar Calculator, where we demystified the energy payback period of solar. To take sand and make ultra-high purity solar-grade polysilicon is one of the most energy-intense processes in industry. You need like 7 or 8 nines of purity, 99.9999. And in fact, most of the energy penalty comes from taking metallurgical-grade polysilicon and purifying it to that degree, because if you have any impurities at all, the cells don't operate. You get a short. And so there's a lot of controversy about what that payback is, because the lower the payback period, the more attractive it looks for solar. And so, a lot of science becomes propaganda. And the devil is in the details, but the assumptions that you make really drive everything. But don't forget, for solar, since the sun doesn't shine at night and it's often cloudy, the this is sort of standard sleight of hand of the pro-solar propagandists, is the stated capacity versus the actual capacity factors are 2 worlds apart. I mean, the average, for a very good commercial solar facility in the southern United States, you might get a capacity factor of around 30%. In Germany, where you have long periods of basically very little sun, and they're far more north than, say, California, you could go and look at the data. The capacity factor for German solar is 11%. So if you have 10 gigawatts of solar power installed, on average, you're producing one, which is a remarkable thing. So when people talk about, look at how much solar we have installed, that's you actually have to say how much energy is that producing and when. Then you have to deal with the challenge of intermittency. And so you have this enormous amount of energy that goes into making a solar power, which does eventually get paid back. In our piece, we landed somewhere between 1 and 5 years, probably closer to 1 in the US and 4 or 5 in Germany. But for nuclear power, I can send you a link afterwards with very detailed calculations. It's roughly about 6 weeks, which means it doesn't take much energy to create energy versus solar. Let's just say the payback period for solar is 2 years. If you want to convert 10% of your existing energy mix to solar, you need to invest 20% of it up front right away, which means you have to divert it from things that we use it for today, like sustaining life. Whereas with nuclear power, if it's 6 weeks, you could get, with 1% of your energy, you could install 9% of the baseload that you need. And so the math it's literally 20 to 30 times better. And that all comes down to the fact that nuclear power is a very high energy dense source. Energy density is king. If you give an engineer energy density, they can work magic. Harnessing low energy fuels is an entirely different challenge, as we're finding out. And Germany's finding out the hard way. Look, everywhere it's tried, it ends up with a more expensive grid, a dirtier grid, and at least a less reliable grid, whether it's New England, which just went through a standard winter storm. It basically was burning oil for 40% of its electricity at the peak of that storm. How is this green, right? In California, rolling blackouts. Eventually, when we'll come to our senses. But yes, the energy payback period on nuclear is surprisingly small. People hate it when we say it because it goes against the narrative. But the answer is nuclear in all calculations.
So unironically, or ironically, depending how you want to look at it, the green activists have actually their policies that they've encouraged have actually led to a dirtier grid.
Yes. Well, again, because they would like a world where fewer people have a high standard of living, and most people are opposed to that. And so you get this impasse. And then the population panics and politicians panic, and they do what Germany has done, which is restart old coal plants, buy every ton of coal they can get their hands on, open up new coal mines, or reopen up old ones that had been shuttered. Buy natural gas from anyone who'll sell it, including Qatar, which, with this World Cup and all of the associated controversy around that, it didn't stop Germany from signing a long-term deal with Qatar. You have to plug your nose and forget your ethics at some point, or you starve your populace, and it just doesn't work. And so, then even going against Bitcoin miners, we wrote a piece which was relatively pro-Bitcoin mining in the sense that if you're going to introduce all this intermittency, then you need to have peaker power plants. The economics of peaker power plants don't work if they're only on a certain percentage of time. So if you could let them make some money by mining for Bitcoin while also agreeing to swiftly toggle in and out of the grid, you can be part of the solution. But of course, New York has effectively passed regulations to shut that down, and the one sort of publicly traded miner is now in a bit of hurt.
Wait, when you said earlier, I just need to pull you up on the point. You said these people want people to have a lower standard of living. Do you mean that directly or indirectly? They're causing that? Because I know green activists. I know people who consider themselves environmentalists. I don't believe these people want others to have a lower standard of living. I think they believe they're right. I think they believe that there is a problem with fossil fuels and we need to curtail it. Maybe they're naive or they've received bad information, but I don't believe these people actually want people to have a worse standard of living.
In the U.S., there was an article just came out of the New Yorker, which we're going to write a piece on. They don't like urban development, for example, or suburban development, like these big homes, McMansions, they call them. And, that they believe, especially in the US here, I can't say how it's articulated in the UK, that that the big SUVs and the homes and all of the sort of niceties of making it in life are obscene and need to be curtailed. And this is many tens of thousands long word essay in the New Yorker. When you read it,
okay,
it's pretty clear. Like they think the way in which we heat our homes and even the way in which we've built our homes and the way in which our homes are sized all needs to come down. They're talking about radically reshaping the way humans live. And like actually, there's many in the environmental movement are anti-vehicle, for example. And if you live in the United States, the vast majority of people who don't live in the city couldn't get by without their vehicles. And even many in the city still commute to work because our infrastructure is not nearly as developed as it should be. But yeah, they are anti. And then beyond that, of course, the Malthusian origins that we referred to earlier are real. And whether or not the marginal environmentalist believes that, they have been impacted by it. As we like to say, if you think nuclear waste is an issue, you're either a victim of propaganda or a knowing creator of it. And so that the fact that the origins of the movement were decidedly anti-human, that the policies of today are consistent with that origin, and the physics dictate that a full implementation of the proposals would result in significant pain and loss to humans, means that whether or not somebody consciously is Malthusian is a distinction without much of a difference. If you are for policies that are provably terrible for humans, it's pretty hard to argue that you're pro-human. And in the Alex Epstein makes this point quite convincingly in his last two books. Many people in this movement view humans as a priori and in all scenarios damaging to nature, which must be protected. And so this is, I mean, people can be upset by it, but it is plain as day if you read what they actually say. If you go back and read the old books, if you read what they still say today, like there is a degrowth movement that is very closely tied to the anti-fossil fuel movement, and we have to recognize that. I think to ignore it is to be naive, frankly.
Well, I'll dig out that New York article. I want to read it, and I want to read your response to it. I've also noticed specifically with Alex Epstein, there has been a kind of concerted effort to try and discredit him. And a question I have for you, actually, that I wonder if you find this. So, similarly with Bitcoin, trying to explain why Bitcoin matters to people. We'll come to what your opinions are on it now. Maybe it's changed. And I think we'll agree with you because we're not crypto people, we're just Bitcoin. But
yeah,
sometimes in trying to explain it to people, why Bitcoin's important, why we care about it, or the issues that we have with the traditional financial system, trying to explain it in a way sometimes without sounding like some nut job. Because sometimes when you try and explain these things, I mean, some of my friends absolutely think I'm some like weird Alex Jones style conspiracy theorist. And I try and explain things in the most rational way. Even recently, we were talking about government debt, and I was showing the Office for Budget Responsibility. I was literally showing the data on the government's website, explaining how they're consistently overspending year after year. But I still come across people who think I'm some kind of nutter. Do you have a similar thing where you're trying to explain this to people that, maybe outside of Doomberg, privately, when you're talking to friends, that it's hard to try and explain this without sounding like you're some conspiracy theorist?
So, interestingly, I find the opposite.
Okay.
There's a lot of people who are quietly uneasy about the way in which our energy policy is unfolding, especially in our demographic. I would say that my children, who have been sort of taught to hate fossil fuels from a very early age in school, think I'm a bit orthogonal to what they would expect. Although they're not bragging to their friends that we write Doomberg, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But your allusion to what transpired with Alex Epstein is a perfect point, which is, they tried to cancel him effectively. And he was powerful enough and had a big enough social media footprint that he was able to snuff that out preemptively, and good for him. They had dug up some old writings that he had done when he was a college student and tried to put a nasty spin on it with the typical tricks. We have found when we explain energy to people, they say, aha, thank you. Because ultimately, two things. One, we are first principle based on physics. And two, we have relevant experience in the area and education in the area, so we can speak to it credibly. And then three, one of the attributes of Doomberg is our ability to explain things in a way that non-experts can understand. And we try to do that in our private lives as well. But, in our demographic, which is sort of, I would say, aged 40 and above, sometimes much higher than 40, we're sort of considered as a sort of breath of fresh air because we take the time to explain these things. And this is what our audience believes anyway. And so that's been quite good. The issue around Bitcoin is very, maybe we could save that for when we want to talk about Bitcoin, but I can understand why that would be slightly different.
Yeah, we will get to Bitcoin because I do want to find out your position on it now, especially as you've attracted a Bitcoin audience. You recently moderated the chat between George Gammon and Michael Saylor, so I definitely want to get to that. I just still want to do a few bits on the energy side of things. Has Doomberg taken? See, I can't remember this from reading the emails that come through, but has Doomberg taken a position on climate change and what the relative risks are?
I would say that we are closer to Alex Epstein and sort of Michael Schellenberger than we certainly are not climate alarmists. Our view is that it's fine to try to reorganize society around the following equation: the highest standard of living we can give to the most amount of people divided by our carbon emissions. That's a fine goal. But I do think that we're more than capable of handling any potential disruptions to the climate that may or may not arise in the next 50 years because of our consumption of fossil fuels. But we're more critical of the path function of minimizing the carbon emissions than we're concerned about. And by the way, in a sense, that's sort of a lost debate anyway, so why waste your time? And if one thing we can do is affect change in the policies that replace our current structure. But I would say that I don't lie up at night worried about the planet I'm leaving behind for my kids.
Good. All right, just going back to the renewables, because I've obviously been a proponent of renewables, a fan of both wind and solar. I've looked at what's happened specifically in Texas, because Texas is usually a case study for Bitcoin miners. But if everything you're saying is correct about nuclear, what argument really is there for wind and solar? What part can they actually play? And is it just a total waste of time, and should everything be moved to nuclear?
So I would say we are more opposed to wind than we are to solar for the following reason. Solar is very seductive because we get irradiated with many orders of magnitude more energy than we could ever possibly use on an ongoing basis. Fractions of a percent. I think it's something like 1% of the solar energy is captured in the form of photosynthesis, and a very small fraction of that is used to feed us. There's just so much energy, basically for free, hitting the earth every day, that it's a problem that's always worth investigating, always worth studying, always worth developing. Our position on solar is the U.S. needs to reclaim, or the West, Europe and the U.S. need to reclaim their manufacturing ability in the space, because right now it's basically outsourced to China, which is using dirty coal and slave labor to produce the panels that we all proudly put on our homes. I own a fair bit of solar technology, mostly as a sort of backup. And so solar, if we could crack the intermittency problem, which again, Bitcoin mining could potentially help, it could play a significant role in our energy future, and we would be certainly for its continued development. Wind, on the other hand, is really just an atrocity. Giant amounts of concrete, of epoxy, of high-end magnets in the motors. A lot of damage to the wildlife, a lot of damage, especially offshore. For people that are supposed to be pro-planet, to be for wind and against nuclear is just absurd on its face.
And that's because of a lot of we know a lot of birds are killed by flying into the blades or flying into the units. And
whales and marine life and the construction of these things, and they're an eyesore, let's be honest. I drive through the rural parts of the state that I live in here in the U.S., and they dot the landscape, and they never seem to be moving. They seem to have an awful lot of downtime. It's the same issue, intermittency, same issue with extended energy payback periods. Most of these projects are just tax loss harvesting for rich people. I mean, these credits get bundled into financial vehicles that allow wealthy people to avoid paying taxes, and so that there's a whole other scandal embedded there.
So I was just having a look at energy on the grid right now in the UK, and the amount of wind is at 56%. So that's obviously a huge part of our grid now. So sort of convincing people that that's not been a good investment, it's going to be really hard, surely.
Well, but let me correct you though. Not that long ago, it was next to nothing, and it's that intermittency, that instability that it brings into the grid. Because when it's not 56%, but it's 4%, that other 52% has to come from somewhere, and it's usually a natural gas peaker plant that is filling the void. And so you are correct that today in Germany and in the UK, it's warm, and it's windy. Great. The power grid is expected to be on all the time. And it's the wildness of like wind is even less predictable than solar, because solar is not going to happen at night and you can predict the weather 7 or 8 days out. But wind is a whole different matter. And if you look at that percent of the grid that is coming from wind over time, you will see a very chaotic line. And the operators of that grid, an electricity grid is a very fine balancing act between supply and demand. And so when people turn on the switch, they expect the light to come on. And so the wind volatility is the issue, not so much the amount that it can produce at any particular time.
But presumably that wind has taken over from, even if it's intermittent, in that intermittent period, it's taken over from coal or gas, I would imagine. So is that even if it's intermittent, is that better for the time that it's up and running?
Well, again, it depends on how you calculate it. So the cost of being ready for the intermittency is never included in the cost and the payback period of wind, right? And what is the point if you can't just use it? And so this is where storage is such a big deal, right? If you could run full throttle and store for when you don't have this intermittency, that would be great, except storage is not ready for it yet, contrary to what people say. And so when it's windy, wind can produce a lot of power. Nuclear power produces the same amount of power all the time. Yeah. It's very predictable.
So what about batteries? Again, this is another technology that people talk about, but it seems to be the one part of society where we don't seem to have technically advanced with the pace of other kind of technologies. For some reason, battery storage seems to just be something that, I don't know, it seems like to me batteries are pretty much the same technology we've had for the last 20, 30 years. Has anything been done in that area?
So battery development is extraordinarily challenging and very, very incremental, percents of improvement a year at best. And batteries for hybrid electric vehicles make a lot more sense than batteries for full electric vehicles. We could talk about that, and make almost no sense for grid storage. I'm not sure if you saw, Joe Rogan had a guest that went viral this week talking about
yes, I did.
Child labor and what they call artisanal mines in the Congo. It's a scandal of epic proportions. The issue with batteries is we do not have enough materials in places we're willing to mine to satisfy the projections for electric vehicles, let alone electric vehicles plus storage. And the amount of batteries you would need to store an hour's worth of the UK's grid is unfathomable. The very same people who are for battery storage are opposed to the permitting of all these new mines that will be needed, and all the diesel fuel that will go into the trucks that will do the mining to get this job done. Our view on batteries is, since batteries are a constraint, we should prioritize to that constraint. If you have one full battery electric vehicle today, Peter, there's probably an 80 kilowatt hour battery pack in there. And so for that 80 kilowatt hour battery pack, we will abate your fossil fuel use of one person. If you split that battery pack in 4 and produce 4 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, where the vast majority of people can abate 90% of their fossil fuel use, 4 times 90 is 360, which means plug-in hybrids are 3.6 times better for displacing fossil fuels than full battery electrics. But the governments around the world are basically prioritizing full BEVs over plug-in hybrids. That's an example of a stupid policy that we could change today that we would be all for. Plug-in hybrids are great. They solve a lot of the problem. They don't come with range anxiety. And for the first 40 or 50 miles that you would drive on a 20 kilowatt hour battery are carbon free, essentially. Well, I mean, depending on where you get your electricity, of course, but certainly fossil fuel free. And then the engine would kick in once the battery is depleted, and you could charge it again overnight. And so the equation we should be optimizing for batteries is gallons of fossil fuel abated per kilowatt hour. The one vehicle that has done the most to abate fossil fuel use in the world is, of course, the Toyota Prius, which has a much smaller battery pack than that. And you get 40 to 50 miles per gallon versus a fleet average when they were rolled out of in the low 20s. And so, those are the types of things that we should be prioritizing. But storage for the grid is incredibly hard. Our good friend, Dr. Chris Kiefer, who runs the Decouple podcast, had a brilliant guy, Mark Nelson, who's a nuclear power expert. They did a show called Masterclass on storage, and I would encourage everybody to listen to it. It was really brilliantly done. Battery packs for storage is probably the dumbest of the suite of very bad ideas being put forth today, and that's being kind.
So would you say the electric car market itself is a bit of a scam in the way it's being sold to us?
We are for the proliferation of technologies that could abate the amount of gasoline that we use to power our vehicles. So to the extent that the explosion in the development and in the interest of electric vehicles has caused the automakers to radically reconsider how the car of the future will be made, that's an unabashedly positive thing. We would be for plug-in hybrids and hybrids as a pathway to when battery technology gets to the point where we could completely abate the need for gasoline. The technology and the battery materials aren't quite there yet, as you've highlighted. And so we're big believers in that you should, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have technologies that can rapidly increase the fuel efficiency of the modern vehicle with minimal sacrifice to standard of living. Go back to the same topic. And we should deploy them in a smart way. So I wouldn't say that it's a scam. I think there are an awful lot of fishy startups and the whole SPAC boom and all that stuff that turned out to be scams. But the concept of partnering smaller and smaller internal combustion engines with bigger and bigger batteries is one that we think is intelligent and we would support.
I'm just going to reiterate what you said as well about that Rogan show is with Siddharth Kara. If anyone's hasn't listened to that show, they should. It's that is a massive scandal in what is happening with the mining of cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo. It kind of blew my mind. He's got a book coming out, which I'm very interested in reading, but we will put that one up in the show notes. I'm not sure did Annie's listen to it.
It's funny you should say that because we know the mining industry well and have consulted in the space and again, come from the commodity sector. This is widely known, this is common knowledge in industry that 70% of the world's cobalt, which finds its way into basically all of the rechargeable batteries on the planet, comes from some of the most horrendous places on Earth as measured by the treatment of labor and child labor and the conditions under which these people are forced to work. This is widely known. It's interesting to me that it's gone super viral all of a sudden. I guess Joe Rogan can do that, but this is one of those same thing with these Apple iPhone cities in China, we call them cities, but they're pretty indistinguishable from forced labor camps if you think about it. I mean, the euphemisms that these public affairs teams have used at these big companies, even just the word artisanal sounds so sweet and harmless, but artisanal is code for slave labor in the Congo, literally hammering away with primitive tools to get the cobalt out of the ground that is then processed by China and stuck into every device that is critical to our lives today. This is a choice. We could invest to develop our own cobalt mines. There's cobalt around the world. It's just not economic. So again, the fact that we have decided that price matters more than the lives of these people is a choice. It's not put in anybody's face, but it's real. And to the extent that Joe Rogan and his guests begin to put it in people's face, I think that's an important thing.
Well, I'm wondering what pressure will now come on the likes of Elon Musk and Tim Cook. You would hope a lot of pressure to the point where they actually have to do something about this. Because my assumption is the likes of Tesla and Apple are going to be some of the biggest buyers of cobalt.
Yeah, all the automakers now. Don't forget, BYD is a much bigger electric vehicle operator than Tesla. In the last week in China, I think I saw some numbers where Tesla sold 9,000 vehicles and BYD sold 56,000 vehicles. There's a whole lot of people that have a lot of explaining to do. Now, it should be said that one of the largest, most heavily invested in research projects in the world is developing lithium-ion batteries that don't need cobalt. And that's going to be a challenge. There are other battery technologies that Toyota's been developing as well on the horizon. So to the extent that this scandal motivates people to develop technologies that move away from cobalt, that too will be a good thing. But this is widely known. It's surprising to me that this suddenly becomes around the clock news and so viral, because this is, ask anybody, all the Western mining companies got out of there years ago just to get away from the taint of it. Left very valuable concessions and resources behind that the Chinese swept in and basically took over. Wherever we have outsourced major dirty manufacturing like this to China, Like the piece we just wrote on solar. Like most people don't realize that almost every solar cell in the world is commingled with polysilicon that was made by forced labor. And the U.S. has this crazy policy where we are incentivizing demand and stopping the importation because the stuff comes from the Uyghurs. And so it's out there, everybody knows it, and then suddenly we start caring about it. So I'm all for it. It's just an interesting phenomenon as as a person in the media. You could probably understand like what makes things go viral and what gets people interested is something we're endlessly fascinated by.
Yeah, I mean, I'd heard previously about these child mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I think I went onto the Tesla website and they had a whole section, maybe on their website or in one of their prospectuses, but explaining how they ethically source their coal. But obviously now listening to the show, I know that was complete bullshit.
Right.
But it'd just be interesting to see what pressure's put on the likes of Elon Musk, because he's the kind of person that if the pressure does come on it, he will have to do something about it and probably can do something about it.
I think Tim Cook as well, though. I mean, Apple in particular is at risk here. And by the way, it's not just cobalt in the Congo. This same polysilicon that goes in to make solar finds its way into all the chips in the world, right? And so the entire economy, many of the key choke points in the entire economy are this is the natural consequence of NIMBYism. If you do not want to have mines operating home and you outsource them, you also outsource the oversight and the environmental impact that those mines will have. So again, we wrote a piece about magnesium. Magnesium is absolutely critical to the auto industry. When Dow shut down its last magnesium plant on the Gulf Coast, China basically took over that entire industry. Magnesium is incredibly dirty to make and tough on the environment. And yet in the US or in the UK or in the EU or in Australia or in Korea, we have environmental controls. It's more expensive, right, to hold companies up to standards and to make sure that they're not polluting local rivers and that they're properly permitted and inspected, and companies are fined if they break their permits and they release too much pollution. None of that goes on in China. So we're just scarring their environment to make ours seem artificially better. We really have to have a sort of a come to Jesus moment, where we talk about the trade-offs here. We rewrote a piece about a lithium discovery in Maine, a really amazing hard rock lithium discovery in Maine that will never get developed because Maine has basically outlawed the permitting of new mines in its state. And yet the same environmental groups that were behind the law and cheered its passage, this law that bans permits of new mines, are for the mandate of electric vehicle penetration in Maine. And we made the joke in the piece, this new mine is 10 miles away as the crow flies from one of the best ski resorts in the Northeast. And I can assure you that if you went into that parking lot, you would see many Teslas. And yet the lithium that's needed, never mind just cobalt, lithium is a very dirty process too, right? The lithium that's needed is right next door, but won't ever be developed. Not in our garden, but maybe in yours. And so this is, not only is there not enough of it, the way in which it's being made today allows us to sort of turn a blind eye to the environmental damage that's being done. Like, do we care about the planet or do we care about the ski hill in Maine?
I think you're right. A come to Jesus moment is needed. All right, listen, we can't let you go without talking a little bit about Bitcoin. You said when you first wrote about it, you were critical of it. You are critical of the wider crypto industry. We're a Bitcoin-only podcast. We very rarely talk about anything else. We're obviously proponents and supporters of Bitcoin, but kind of where are you at with it now? Because obviously you've become more exposed to it by the fact you've got an audience that comes to you who are Bitcoiners. Like, where are you guys with it now?
Yeah, so let's take a step back and start with where I'm sure you and I and Danny all agree, which is there is a need for ensuring against the debasement of fiat currencies. I think that government spending and government printing is out of control. I'm a big proponent of gold, and I think in the rationale for gold and Bitcoin, there's an awful lot of overlap in the Venn diagram. And I think as an asset amongst the digital currencies, if we were to buy one, it would be Bitcoin. If we were to buy one, yeah, and we might. I had a conversation with Lynn Alden about it. That if the crypto world explodes to the point where it drags down the price of Bitcoin to an attractive enough level, I would toss a few percent of my net worth towards it. And I jokingly said to her when I had that private conversation that me just asking you how to buy it might mark a bottom, because I was getting ready for much lower prices. This was shortly after the FTX, SBF implosion occurred. And so,
sorry, just to jump in, what's an attractive price for you?
I told her that I'd be a buyer at 5,000.
And when would you be a seller?
I would just buy and hold. So I should explain my personal investing philosophy. We earn money and we transact in fiat because that's, we're law-abiding citizens and that's the way the world works and it's convenient. We save money by buying real assets like gold and land and collectibles. And then we invest privately where we could affect the outcome with our own skills and network. And we sort of call that sweat alpha. We don't speculate in the stock market, but we do save by buying real assets. And if we were to buy Bitcoin, that would be an allocation where in that category of allocation that we would make it. We would never buy crypto. We think all crypto are Ponzi's to the extent that Bitcoin is an asset, and Bitcoin does have some useful properties. I just don't know how it'll ever be. Our critique of Bitcoin has always been twofold. One, the regulatory regime will not allow it, and they will crack down on it, and it will be used as a bridge to central bank digital currencies, which we think are a surveillance nightmare. And then two, that the price of Bitcoin was being artificially manipulated by the crypto world vis-a-vis Tether and other stablecoins. And we think that a bottom won't be in for Bitcoin until the Tether situation is resolved. And that's why I was talking to Lynn about learning how to actually buy and store it, in my own hard wallet or cold wallet or whatever you guys call it. But I understand the attractiveness of it, and I understand that the Bitcoin network itself is a pretty interesting phenomenon, and the decentralization of it is attractive to me. I just don't think the government's going to let me spend it. And look what they did in Canada. We wrote a piece called "Just Watch Me" that roasted Justin Trudeau, who I think is the intellectual weak link of a pretty pathetic set of leaders in the G7 today as it stands. But the first thing they did was they slapped sanctions on these wallets that were donating to the Bitcoin crowd. I think the sanctioning of Tornado Cash is a real troubling sign. We wrote a piece on that.
But hold on, the Canadian government also sanctioned donations which were made
Correct.
in fiat as well.
Exactly.
It wasn't just Bitcoin.
Right, but when it mattered, you couldn't spend your Bitcoin, right? And so the whole point is that you still have to operate within society, and it's up. Our sort of, I had a great conversation with Marty Bent on this. Ultimately, money is what the government says it is, and so the solution to our money problems isn't a new currency; it's a new government. This is probably where we disagree a little bit. It's hard for us to envision where you could legally use Bitcoin as a currency in the U.S. if the government didn't want you to. Which is what we saw in Canada in a very small way. But look at how they sanctioned Tornado Cash, right? Yes, Tornado Cash is used for money laundering, but there are also legitimate uses for it, like wanting to make a private donation that can't be traced back to your main assets. Criminals use highways. We wouldn't tear up a highway just because criminals happen to use it, but they sanctioned a piece of software, which we think was a very dangerous precedent as well. So, but back to Bitcoin, when Tether is resolved, and Binance is resolved, and Bitfinex is resolved, and all of this is sort of washed away, that's when we think the bottom of this sort of secular bear market in Bitcoin will be in. And that's a point where we would make a multiple percent allocation of our net worth and stick it in a safe somewhere and give it to our children someday, like the gold coins they'll get when I die as well.
What if we are at the bottom though, and you miss it?
Then I will have missed it, yeah. I'm not, this is why I don't play in the stock market. I'm not good at predicting prices.
So what is your fear with Tether? Because this is a rumor that's come up for years and years and years.
I just think that this is the part where I perhaps disagree with many in the Bitcoin community. To not acknowledge that this phenomenon is affecting the price of Bitcoin, or that there is an awful lot of red flags around the organization. The biggest user of it was Sam Bankman-Fried, right? Literally. And so I simply don't believe that they have the assets they claim to have to back the stablecoin that they've issued, in contrast to Circle, who I do believe, and USDC. And we made a prediction in our sort of year in review for our Pro tier that when the dust settles, USDC will be the stablecoin of choice in the digital currency world, and it'll be fully approved, by the U.S. authorities for that purpose. I don't believe Tether's story. I don't believe Binance's story. I don't believe Bitfinex's story. So I think they're all going to get washed out. And once they do, the price of Bitcoin will be a real price, in my view. And if it's up from here, great, congratulations. And if it's down from here, interesting, it might be a buying opportunity. But I think the failure to acknowledge the cancer of Tether is to the detriment of the Bitcoin community. Many people that I respect on almost all other issues have a different view than me, and that's fine, by the way. It's totally fine that you and I could disagree on something. Like you said with Alex Epstein, like I don't agree with everything that he says, but he's intelligent, he expresses his views politely, and he makes me think. And those are three wonderful attributes of any human, and I'm happy to talk to Alex anytime and happy to talk to most polite Bitcoin proponents as well, because I found many of them to be intelligent, to have strongly held views that they express politely, and that's fine.
Yeah, you also get a few that will do it not so politely.
Sure, and I get trolls all the time on Twitter from the renewable crowd, from the anti-nuclear crowd, from the Bitcoin crowd, from the anti-Bitcoin crowd. Like if we have a saying that if a troll tweets something bad about you, but you have them on mute, did they even type? Because does it really matter? But that's not my audience. So we have an ideal client. We know who they are, and that's who we cater to. We don't cater to the trolls. All
right, just a final thing from me. What are you looking at for 2023? What should we be thinking about? What do you think our audience should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think the resolution of the European energy crisis and how well January and February are with regard to weather and gas use is a big one. Obviously, we believe that Tether, Binance, and Bitfinex will be resolved. I think SBF is going to turn state's evidence and roll up that whole ugly side of the industry. We'll get a true price for Bitcoin, which is great. And I do think that China's reopening is really a 180-degree change, literally overnight. We have many friends in China. I used to lead a large team that was based there and traveled there 4 times a year for the better part of a decade. The 180 in China is going to shock people. COVID is probably in 70 to 80% of the population right now. And the thing is, they did this just ahead of Chinese New Year, where they have this mass migration. So it's going to be in everybody. And then when they come out of New Year, the Chinese economy is going to be roaring hot. It's going to look bad for the next 2 or 3 months because there's going to be missing workers and supply chain issues and all that stuff. But look out, world, because China's coming back in 2023 in a big way.
All right. Well, listen, tell people where to go and find out more, where they can subscribe. Do you know what's funny thing was, actually? I'd been getting your emails and reading them, and I only found out today I wasn't actually a subscriber. I am now. I have a paid subscription, but I didn't realize that from the emails. But tell people where to go and subscribe.
Yeah, so our free subscribers, do get a pretty healthy preview of all of our pieces. So that's why you were reading some of our words, but hopefully not getting all the way to the end, because otherwise there's something wrong with our software. So all of our writing can be found at doomberg.substack.com. We are 100% subscriber supported. We accept no ads or sponsorships. There's nothing wrong with those business models, but we believe we have complete editorial freedom running the subscription model. We're also on Twitter at DoombergT. T is in Twitter. Somebody is squatting on the handle Doomberg, which is unfortunate, but at DoombergT is where we are, as long as Twitter is still a thing. But predominantly at Substack, which has been great. And like we said, we publish 6 to 8 times a week. Our objective is to delight our subscribers, and we work every day to do so.
Amazing. Well, listen, it's great to have you on. Hopefully we can do this again sometime next year, have another catch up, find out what's going on. I just wish you a happy new year, and hopefully we'll see you in 2023.
Same to you guys. It was a great pleasure. And I'll tell you what, if Tether does get resolved, we'll come back on and talk about it.
All right, we'll do that. All right, take care. Have a great new year.
Thanks, you too.